Yeah, well, they want to get out of it, don't they? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first meeting of the Strategy, Finance and Policy Committee. Could I ask everyone to note the fire safety instructions, please? There are no planned fire drills for tonight. If, however, the alarm goes off, please use the fire exit through the main doors of the hall or the fire exit in the storeroom adjacent to the stage. The fire assembly point is the island in front of the main entrance to the building. Please do not delay your evacuation to collect any belongings. Please do not return to the building until given permission to do so by council staff. I would also like to remind you to please switch off your mobile phones or turn them to silent. Please note that this meeting will be live streamed where the proceedings are capable of repeated viewing. Please ensure your microphone is switched on when speaking and you speak clearly into the microphone. Once finished speaking, please switch off your microphone to avoid feedback noise. If you are seated in the public area of the chamber, it is likely that your image will be captured by the recording cameras and result in your image being part of that broadcast. If members are for any reason not present for the whole debate on an item, you will not be allowed to vote on that item. May I remind members to declare any interest and the nature of the interest at the beginning of an agenda item, and that on declaring a pecuniary interest, you are required to leave the room when that item of business is considered. So members, item 1, apologies for absence and substitute members. I have received apologies from Councillor Michael Hoy, Councillor Richard Lambourne, Councillor Elliot Mason, and Councillor Vilma Wilson is substituting for Councillor Elliot Mason. Is that right, members? Councillor Lisa Newport.
I'm substituting for Councillor Hoy.
Thank you. Item 2, non-members attending. Are there any non-members in attendance? I note Councillor Daniel FD and Councillor Angelina Marriott. Thank you. Members, are there any declarations of interest, please? So that's none. Item 4, urgent business. There is no urgent business. So members, if you turn your attention to item 5, please. Members, we will the review and development of policies and strategies. Members, we will now consider the report of Mr. Greg Campbell, Director of Policy and Transformation, providing an overview of the planned approach to the review and development of policies and strategies in 2024-25. The report begins on page 5.1. Ms. Nicholson, do you have anything to add to the report?
No, not at this time, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Okay. Members, do you have any questions? Councillor John Mason.
Thank you, Chairman. 2 questions. Would you like them taken together and answered together, or?
Ms. Nicholson.
I'm happy to take them together.
Okay, right. When the list comes back in November, will it be prioritised? And the second question is, when the transformation plans have been produced, and they're obviously going to be subject for some form of due diligence at committee, will they be married to the appropriate committees? And I'll give an example here. Will the Environment Department, for instance, transformation plan, go to the Environment and Climate Change Committee? So 2 simple questions, but it lays out where we're going a little more certainly on those points.
Thank you, Councillor Mason.
Sure. So when the list comes back in November, we'll be able to give you an indication of which policies are intended to be reviewed, which policies are new and going to be in development, and so on and so forth in terms of the strategies as well. So there would be that ability to show you that in November.
Can I come back, Chair? That's not an answer to my question. My question was quite simply, and I'll put it directly again, is the list going to be prioritised? In other words, will it have the most important ones to do at the top of the list, ranging down to those that are less important as we go through. So when these are handed over to committees, they know already what this committee would prefer to see and wish to see given the highest priority. Thank you.
So I think in terms of prioritisation, it's a subjective matter. So we would have a look and rationalising those policies and strategies against a number of other different factors. So the list could come back, but if there were policies and strategies on here, for example, that members felt should be higher in the list of priorities, that could be indicated at the time. Obviously, when it comes back in November, we may not have started reviewing those policies, so we will be at an early stage in terms of their development. I hope that answers your question.
And my second question, please.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. So the transformation plans very much are inward looking in terms of processes that the services are going to go through to improve themselves. Where something affects service levels or affects something that the members would need to be aware of, then that piece of work will be put forward as a report to that various committee where it is having a change in the service that we are providing to the residents.
Again, Chairman, it's not a complete answer. Obviously, when we were going through the service challenges on the One to the One team, there was a programme board which all the challenges came to. So what that answer seems to suggest is that unless it affects a service level or something that would be of interest to members, members won't know anything about it. That doesn't seem satisfactory to me.
Apologies, didn't mean to miss that part out. There is still a transformation board and they will still be going to the transformation board. And if they are then affecting their service levels or if they're affecting the residents, as I say, then they go forward to committee. But that is still definitely in place, the transformation board.
Can we know, Chairman, what the transformation board makeup is, please?
As previously, leader and deputy leader from both authorities and the chief exec.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Johnson? Yeah. Councillor Ward, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just interested to understand how divergent these policy changes are from previous versions.
So we won't know until
Can you speak up a bit,
Sorry,
please?
just work for you. So we won't know until we start to get into the review process itself. Some of them might be minor changes, maybe slight updates due to legislation. It could be as simple as just changing the templates that they fit in and look like Rochford Council policies. Some of the reviews may indicate that there needs to be more thorough changes. It could be that we're consolidating a policy with some other policies so that we have one overarching. So it depends on what arises during the review process itself. So I couldn't say at this moment exactly what changes will be happening in regard to each policy.
And if I may come back, maybe just adding to what Councillor Mason said, will they come back for inspection by members?
So as each policy is reviewed and it comes out the other side of that process, it would need to come back to committee to be approved as a council policy. So you would see those at the other end of the process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. Councillor Belton, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I think updating policies and strategies should be something that's done periodically. Laws change, priorities change, health and safety rules change. It's an enormous piece of work, just looking at that list that was provided, and some of it really gets down into the nitty-gritty of what the council does. So when they start to come forward, will part of that review have a proposal for when it will be reviewed again so that we can create some kind of time structure? Because I don't think it's sensible to do this in block once every few years. You'd kind of, especially coming back to Councillor Mason's point, where we have priorities or things that we feel are more important, they should be reviewed more periodically, and then it stops this enormous piece of work, because we're talking about November as our next target, but probably nothing will have actually started of any sort of substance by then anyway. So just something to consider as this report progresses forward.
Sorry, if I just may. So, Councillor Belton, you're talking about more of a monitoring piece for our policies, where going forward, in terms of, you know, how we're going to monitor those changes,
Yeah,
such as legislation.
Yeah, if I may, it may be that there is a policy on reviewing policies that sets out how often we want it done and in an order of some kind of priority list, so that obviously some will have to be ad hoc, because if legislation changes, we shouldn't be then catching up 2 years behind legislation. We should be on the front foot of that. So part of one of those policies may be that we're constantly reviewing legislation or health and safety changes, so that should something happen, exactly like we would do in the business world, is you incorporate that into a policy change sooner rather than later. But I just recognise that this is an enormous piece of work, and I think it's an opportunity to now stagger this moving forward for the next time it needs to be done.
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify on there, I think it highlighted slightly later in your report. It's envisaged that we have a policy and strategy register. So as the policies are reviewed, they go onto the register and they would be set up with an automatic reminder of when that policy or strategy is due for review. And those timetables can vary. Some policies might be 3 years, it could be a longer, it could be 5 years, for example. Now, that doesn't prevent a policy from coming up for review earlier if, like you say, the legislation changes and the service take note of that and they need to make some adjustments to that policy. But the policy register, policy and strategy register, will be that mechanism to make sure that there is that consistent approach to the review of all policies. And with regards to it being a huge task this time round, I think when we get into that review process, some of those policies will go because they've become out of date, they're no longer required, but it won't all happen in one go. So it's going to be a phased process. And so as we get through those reviews, the new policies go on the register, and then it starts to take its on natural life, really, in terms of its review process.
Does that answer your question? Yep. Councillor Wootton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I read this report and scratched my head, and I read it again and still scratch my head, because it seems that actually all this is agreeing to is good housekeeping. And I have to say that I looked at the list under the appendix, and it's a pretty formidable list. I think I'm understanding a little better tonight from the conversation that's emerging that this is about trying to unify the two sets of policies across the two authorities so that there are better economies. But I do worry a little bit, because some of these, what I would have expected to be going on in the background, some of these policies go back an awfully long way. And if they haven't been reviewed since then, it's a great piece of work. It's a huge piece of work, but it does frighten me that it's not business as usual. Here are we sort of agreeing to something which is very straightforward. But I'm not sure that's a question, but see what you can do with it.
I'll do my best there. So it is in part a housekeeping task, you know, as you say, a lot of these policies have come about historically, and we now want to get into a position where we're on the front foot and knowing when things are coming up for review. There is an opportunity to look at consolidating policies that straddle both organisations where it's appropriate to do so. And they might be the types of policies that rely on best practice. So, for example, health and safety, where you couldn't argue that it's one or the other. That just is what it is. But also there's policies will have say gone out of time or no longer relevant because we've changed as an organisation, our priorities may have changed, so we need to make adjustments there. So it is partly housekeeping, and it is partly setting us up for the future in terms of how we want to manage it going forward.
Okay, Councillor Ward, do you want to come back?
Yes, please, thank you. Yeah, we've got one recommendation here in R1. From what I'm hearing in the conversation we're having in the debate, there is a possible R2 recommendation for ongoing monitoring. Now, I don't know if we can frame that or whether that would be something we would want to put into the recommendations here. But, you know, what I'm hearing from the debate that's gone round with the amount we've got to look at, and also the fact of making sure it's done on a monitoring basis.
So Councillor Ward, I think 2.6 does cover that point that you're making about ongoing monitoring.
Does it?
I think that's what that
Is it in the recommendations, Chairman?
No, so it is part of the report. So
Can you point that one out to me, please?
2.6, is that right?
Sorry?
If I'm reading that. I'll just ask Ms Nicholson to clarify that. Councillor.
Yes, so at point 2.6, the final sentence, it says the approach will ensure policies and strategies are maintained and reviewed in a timely manner. Now, what that means is as a policy is or strategy is coming up for review, you yourselves are the decision makers on that policy. So the policy would go through its process and it would have to be reconfirmed as a policy of the council. So if you was to monitor it, you'd kind of be doing it twice, if you see what I mean, because at some point that policy is going to pop out of the system and you're going to have a look at that and decide if you're happy with that as a policy or strategy of the council. So I
Yeah,
think
so-
to add the monitoring might be a little bit overzealous.
So it's accounted for? Yeah, I
It
can
is.
see it now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor, Mrs Wilson?
Thank you, Chair. Just a question, really. This list of policies here, I'm assuming forms in minor parts, part of the risk register that the audit committee would indeed look at. Certainly driving at work, and I could list half a dozen, but I won't, should actually come here. Now I know that the auditing is slightly behind at the moment, but if one of these policies came up for audit and was declared to have fallen short, would that automatically propel its standing on the register as to the order that things will be looked at? Because I note here that quite a few of these are out of date, and I think if this was actually listed in any private business, I think someone would actually lose their jobs. Okay, thank you.
So just to come back on that, I think when I mentioned earlier about when it comes back in November, there've been, an indication of the priority. What I would say is that's not a static list. And because things happen outside of the council and inside of the council too, that list can shift around. So if something like audit was to occur and there was an issue that was flagged, that would go up the scale in terms of priority. In terms of the policies being out of date, what I would caution with that is, yes, some of the policies are old. That does not necessarily mean that the content of them is flawed in any way. So it's just to add that caveat. And obviously, as we go through the process over the summer months, we'll be able to give you stronger assurance of the content of those policies when we come back in November.
May I,
Thank you.
Chair?
Is there?
May I come back,
Yeah,
Chair?
you can come back.
Thank
Councillor,
you.
Mrs. Wilson.
Thank you. I totally understand what you're saying. It's just that I happen to know that the driving at work policy 2017 probably does need updating. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, Mrs. Wilson. Okay, members, I think looking at this and just picking up on what Councillor Wootton said earlier about, I think he used the word unifying. I think some of these policies that we're looking at are desperately need to be updated, because if I was working in the one team, is it our grievance policy or is it Brentwood's grievance policy that applies to that employee? I don't know, and I guess it's quite hard to work out. So I think there's a definite need here to get this piece of work done. Can I just bear with me a moment? Sorry, members, thank you. Councillor FD is indicating, so I'm just going to allow Councillor FD to ask a question.
Thank you, Chairman. It's not really a question, it's an observation. Something that really annoys me with how we deal with our residents. It says customer charter. Customer charter seems like residents have a choice. And if you live in the district, you don't have a choice. You can't have your rubbish collected from somewhere else. So I'd really love that name changed to resident. I think I've had this conversation with Greg a few years ago. It just really gets my goat that we haven't got a choice as customers like a customer does.
Okay, Councillor FD, thanks for that point, and we'll note that. Thank you. So, members, if I can move to the recommendation 1 then, if everyone's happy with that, to agree the proposed approach for the review of the council's existing policy and strategy framework. So, on a show of hands, please, all those for? So that's unanimous, members. Thank you very much. So members, before we proceed to items 6 and 7 on the agenda, I'd just like to welcome Mr. Andy Beer, sorry, my mistake. Beer's the council's senior asset and property officer. Mr. Beer will introduce the two items on behalf of Mrs. Phoebe Barnes, the council's director of assets and investments. So item 6, members, we will now consider the report of the Director of Assets and Investments seeking approval of the principles outlined within the report, which will form the basis of more detailed policy documents. The report begins on page 6.1. Mr. Beer, do you have anything to add to the?
Briefly, just to say good evening, members. This is my first committee. Just to say this follows on obviously from the previous report and highlights two particular, so I'll speak of them, sorry, two specific policies related to property, that for disposals and that for leasing. And again, it will come back to members in September with the detail. And this report just asks members really to, or it outlines the kind of content those two policies will include, and just asks members to endorse the sort of the key principles related to those policies, which are kind of good practice in terms of the suite of documents that you would expect to see around disposal and leasing of land and property assets. And obviously happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Councillor, Mr. John Mason, please.
Thank you, Chairman. The question relates to leases, and it relates to an unfortunate instance that must occur from time to time where a lease is in breach, or should we say a lessee is in breach of the lease. And I'd like to think that where we have a policy, that policy would require the council to proceed with utmost diligence to deal with breaches and not leave them just sitting. So I'd like an assurance that when the lease policy principles come back, that there is a line in there appropriately to deal with that sort of issue when it happens. I don't wish to give examples, Chairman, but that there are concerns in my mind.
Thank you very much. Mr. Beer?
Yeah, no, we would certainly take a robust approach to any breaches of our leases in order to protect the council's interests.
Members, are there any other questions? Councillor Wootton.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, I've done a lot of head scratching in reading these reports because a bit more head scratching. Simple question to begin with, because depending on the answer will depend whether I've got a supplementary. But are we saying that from the implication in the first paragraph that there is not a disposal policy or a lease policy at present?
There are, you'll have to forgive me because I've only been here a few weeks, but from the documentation, I've seen there are some processes, absolutely, which are followed. I think this, the aim of this document is to bring processes, procedures, practices, and say policies into the document. So I think there are various documents which are being followed, and the aim of this is to bring those all together so members have an opportunity to look at it in a sort of holistic way.
Councillor Wootton, you would like to come back?
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, that's a helpful response. But the first part of the report rather seems as if it's a light bulb moment, that implying that we've not actually had these policies in the past. What from your reply I'm determining is that it's about modernising them, it's about streamlining them, it's about perhaps picking up, because a little bit like Councillor Mason, I have a number of issues of the past in mind where we have leased or we've disposed of, and I believe we've done it quite legally. So I wouldn't like there to be an inference from this report that, hey, we haven't had any of these policies in the past. It's the first bit of the report that bothers me. The second bit of the report, where you go on from 2.2, is very fair because it talks about, 2.4, this framework needs to be refreshed. But I think it's a bit mean at the start with implying that we haven't even got any policies to begin with. So I think there ought to be some record of the fact that there are policies. And I think had I been writing the report, I might have worded it slightly differently. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Wootton. Councillor John Mason, please.
Thank you, Chairman. There is an asset and disposal policy. If the officer cares to go to an executive report in July 22 on the ADP, you'll find it is referenced in there. And when I asked about it, I was actually sent a copy of it. I doubt very much whether the emails, my email trails, I think they're weeded, aren't they, by time? So I doubt whether I've still got it. But there certainly is an asset disposal policy, and Councillor Wootton is entirely correct. We are not just suddenly waking up to a light bulb, but I do hope that we are going to improve it, because I must admit, having read it, I thought, oh, I'm not quite sure what some of this means. So there is benefit to have it reviewed, but maybe we could just pick up where we left it.
And it was never the intention in this report to suggest that there was anything, that there was nothing in place.
Thank you. Councillor Danielle Belton, please.
Thank you. Just a point on 3.2. So it talks about the policy, the sections that will be included within the policy. And I was quite surprised that within there isn't something referring to consultation with residents, businesses and groups. Something that's been heavily criticised in the past is decisions being made without sufficient consultation, so much so that consultations have then happened multiple times to try and recoup that. So it seems important to me that that would be a section within the policy so that no one has the opportunity to bypass or any other version of bypass.
Yep. Do you take this for Fiona? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Councillor. I think, I'm sure this is working. Is that working? Can you hear?
Yeah.
I think the my nervousness about putting that in as a sort of line in every disposal is that there'll be big and there'll be small disposals. Clearly, the larger disposals generally will be subject to subjects coming back to a committee anyway, because we have to declare land surplus. So that will give committee the opportunity to say, we'd like you to carry out some consultation on this disposal. If, for example, it's a very small piece of land that's very low value and has very low community value, then it would seem a bit overkill to apply it to everything. So we're well aware that obviously there are some disposals and leases actually that may well require significant local community engagement, but I think we have to look at that. Officers have to have some discretion to look at that on a case-by-case basis. And as you sign off that disposal, you'll get the opportunity to, or as you sign off the land being declared surplus, you'll get the opportunity to stay then. And actually, I think this is where one thing that we will be doing is working very closely with ward councillors to ensure that they know that disposal is coming forward.
Councillor Belton.
Thank you. And that all makes perfect sense. But for me, what you've just said should be the section within the policy, that it basically states that consultation will take place where it is a requirement to do so. Where there is no community or no seen community interest, it wouldn't need to happen, because then there is an approach to take. It's not just an opinion that, oh, well, no one really cares about that pavilion, we'll let that one go, or no one cares about that plot of land, because yes, you can engage with the ward councillors, but it makes sense to me that we have something in there. And that can be, exactly as you very eloquently put, that it's not surplus for every single disposal or lease, but there will be some that it absolutely is. So just something I'd like considered. Thank you.
Do you want to come back on that? Thank you, Councillor Belton.
We can certainly take it away and have a look at it and see how we could word something. I'd be erring caution. Otherwise, you'd be getting things coming back and going out to consultation for every single item. But we can take it away and have a look and see how we could bring it into some form of words into the main policy.
Just one final point. My colleague has ably assisted me that maybe engagement would be better than consultation to aid that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs Wilson?
Hello, thank you, Chair. I would just like to say that I totally agree with everything that Councillor Belton has just said. I do think ward members as a minimum need to be consulted, please, because I'm aware that that's not always happened in the past, and then we've had the very lengthy and painful consequences to deal with to correct it. So I do feel really strongly that ward members as minimum. Also, can I just ask, is the would any member have the ability to call in if that was needed, if it was felt that for whatever reason the officers would felt that the land or the asset or whatever it was of such of low value it could just go through without any member consultation?
So, thank you, Councillor Mrs Wilson. So 3.2 does say about the ward members will be consulted process. And if you can come back on the call in, please, Fiona, thanks.
So tonight's report is really around agreeing the principles. When the policy actually comes back in September, you can have a look at that and see if that meets the requirements that you believe are necessary in terms of ensuring that any decisions are appropriate. Again, I wouldn't want to make this committee busy with every single lease transaction and land disposal. Land disposal is perhaps slightly different because obviously it's a permanent, but the team do a lot of lease transactions, lease renewals, rent reviews. It would make you very busy as a committee if all of that came back to committee. So I think we need to take that away and have a look at policy, and you can obviously have a look at it when it comes back in September.
Thank you, Fiona. Councillor Mr Mason.
Thank you, Chairman. There is a precedent, of course. There were 30, I believe it was 30, lease renewals that came before the executive less than 6 months ago. So if we have that precedent, I can't see why we're now disposing of it, because I saw it at the time as chair of the executive committee entirely right, that we should go through the renewals and ensure that they were on proper footing. In fact, Councillor Ward will know he participated in one renewal on a private basis or a community basis, and it was necessary to get into detail. So I don't agree. I expect this committee to see renewals, all of them.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Mr Mason. Does anyone? Pardon? Yeah, go on. Yep.
Thank you, Chairman. It was just to add on the question about call-in, that the council does have a call-in mechanism. That function sits now with the Scrutiny and Performance Committee. So I won't read the full standing order, but members might want to consider that any call-ins are taken to the Scrutiny and Performance Committee or raised with its chairman in the first instance.
Thank you, Matt. Is there any other questions, members? Yep. Councillor Mr Wilson, please.
Yeah, very simple thing. It refers back to a point at 3.2 of advising ward members. I'd like to see, rather than the process of how and when ward members and chairs will be consulted, I'd like to see something in there that gives an assurance that they will be consulted, not a process about maybe. I'm very much with Councillor Mason here. I really don't see how this can go forward without there being an assurance that ward members will be involved.
Okay, so just coming back on that, Mr Wilson, so this is, the detail will come forward in September on the whole policy, and that's at the point where I think that we should be then looking at that level of detail. Okay, is that okay? Okay, members, any other questions? Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Chairman. No, it's just a clarification on what Matthew Sickley said. It was quite interesting. I'm very glad a colleague, Councillor Mason, came up with the instance of a certain lease, which I was very dissatisfied with on behalf of the RAF. And he mentions that, and I would have concern as to where that call-in would be. Now, I just want clarification. Would that call-in have to go through the review system? Is that what is actually being asked for anyone to do on an individual lease?
Thank you, Chairman. It probably is helpful actually if I do read the, I suppose, the standing order or the terms of reference of the committee now. So the only reference to calling in the new constitution of the council is as follows: that within the terms of reference of the Scrutiny and Performance Committee, that scrutiny can, quote, exercise the right to call in for reconsideration decisions made but not yet implemented by any committee where appropriate. So that's something that's often called requisition in other councils. So what it's saying is that the responsibility for the call-in function, such as it exists in this council, rests with the committee. Members will appreciate, of course, that we've moved from an executive to a committee model. So the flavour, the rhythm of decisions you will find in this new era is more collective than it was perhaps individual in the past. So where members do see a decision taken by a committee, which is where the vast majority of significant decisions will be taken, and they have concerns about the decision for whatever reason, it would be appropriate in the first instance to, I would suggest, speak to the lead member, the relevant policy committee chair, and then where a member feels that there should be a call-in, to raise that with the Scrutiny and Performance Committee, namely through its chairman, who will then consider whether that's something that should sit on the Scrutiny and Performance Committee's agenda.
Just because this is, yeah, absolutely. This is, I think there's a need of real clarification going out to members in regards to this, because initially where this came up with this particular lease that was required, and it was quite complicated, and I think it may still even be bouncing about at this moment in time and not complete through legal means. I feel that it was quite easy last time for me to actually make a request to the then leader to have a look at that, which the then leader did and asked for that, and the portfolio holder at that time, or the lead member, also supported that look. So basically, if it's just a certain lease that there is a problem and a ward member has a problem with that lease in particular that they're concerned, be it pavilion, be it anything else that comes up that's an asset, it then should go to the scrutiny and should be, that is the appropriate area for call-in and could be gone directly to them. Is this what you're saying?
Yeah, Matt, if you can answer that, please.
I can, thank you, Chair. With apologies to Councillor Ward, I think I probably gave you the formal answer rather than the normal answer, I suppose. So what I've just outlined for you is the formal process for call-in that the council has. What that doesn't do is negate the kinds of relationships that officers and members have with one another in terms of shaping decisions before they come to committee. So if in a hypothetical, there was a prospective disposal or lease renewal or non-renewal that you were aware of coming forward, perhaps on the horizon for a committee on the forward plan, it's entirely appropriate for you to raise that with the relevant policy committee chairman or the leader of the council, or indeed senior officers as that decision is coming forward. The formal call-in function now is a sort of retrospective one. So once a committee has made a decision on something, there is a power that the Scrutiny and Performance Committee has to call that in, take another look at it. So in the example you've given me from before May, that could still happen under the new system. What would happen if a decision had already been taken under the new system is Scrutiny and Performance Committee is the place to go to call that decision in, have it looked at again, and see if you can't get the decision changed. Or the committee might well say, no, we'll stick with what we've done. So I'm sorry if that muddied the water. It wasn't my intention.
If I may, Chairman,
Yeah,
a decision had been taken, and the decision was really it negated the purpose of the whole lease. So we had to be
sorry,
reviewed.
Councillor Ward, can I just interject on this? Because I know what you're talking about. And we do have to remember that officers do have delegations made to them. And in the case of what you're talking about, that can be dealt with a delegation. So we just need to be aware of that not every single detail would come back to committee. Now, if we were to do that, I think we'd be all day, because we have to let officers get on with their jobs. But the scheme of delegations we have agreed. I mean, if members aren't happy with those delegations, then that's another matter, isn't it, to take forward? So with the constitution. So does that help with that, or does that made it further complicated?
I think, as you say, we're working through a new system and we're all having to learn how the system works as far as members are concerned. I guess if I have an issue and a problem with something, I will gradually have to figure out who will be dealing with it and how it's going to be dealt with. But from what Matthew is actually saying, my first port of call will actually be overview and scrutiny. To some extent, if I'm not happy with something or needs to be called in. That seems to be the point that's being offered to me at this moment in time.
Matt, do you just want to come back one final time on this then? And
I do. Thank you, Leader, and I'm grateful for the indulgence. It's probably entirely my fault. I've confused this slightly. Actually, I think your first port of call is entirely appropriate to be with officers taking decisions, the leader and his administration who are bringing decisions forward, and so forth. The scrutiny committee is almost your last port of call. Decisions taken, you don't like it for reason X, you're going to go and address that. The final thing I will say is I entirely agree with Councillor Ward with your point that members, officers as well, are learning how this new system is operating. And I would just like to strongly encourage all members who are available to attend the transition to committee system final session, which is being run next Wednesday with the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, and we will ensure that all members have the recording to view afterwards. I'm sure those kinds of questions will be brought up there. Thank you, Chairman.
okay, Matt, thanks for the plug on the training. Members, I hope you noted that. Otherwise, Matthew will be sending an email around to remind members. Councillor Belton, please.
Thank you. Just a quick point, just summarize, taking in these last few minutes of conversation. To me, it strengthens what Councillor Mason said about the decisions have to come in front of the committee, because otherwise, from what Matt said, you can only call in a decision once it's gone through committee for that decision. So if it's gone through under delegated responsibilities, there is no call-in process for that. Now, whilst I completely hear what Fiona is saying about we're not here to micromanage, we have to trust officers are doing their job, there's also a risk there of decisions being taken that once we eventually hear about that decision, it's done. It's too late to call into ONS. So you almost, as Councillor Mason said, you kind of want that summary of these are the decisions that we have taken in principle. Do you agree them? So that we don't have to get into the minutiae of detail. But from what you've said, Matt, if it doesn't come in front of a committee, there is no way that that can then be scrutinised. And I think that is a real risk.
Thank you, Councillor Belton. I've just asked Fiona if she can just come back on this. So I think we do need some further explanation around this.
So in some ways, there's nothing new here because there's already a scheme of delegation that officers have. We're not suggesting that changes. I don't think anyone around the table is actually suggesting that changes. You have, and actually particularly with Andy's appointment, you have experienced officers now coming into the assets team who absolutely know the legislation upon which they can act, particularly in things like the Section 123 of the Local Government Act. So I totally understand your concerns. You do have a scheme of delegation, though. I think, as I said earlier, it would be I think it would be quite difficult for you as a committee to see every single lease renewal, rent review, disposal that officers would do in detail, certainly. Clearly, I think your concerns are answered by our discussions with the ward councillors. So if ward councillors are engaged, they as part of their role, they can be giving feedback from the community, which I think is where your concerns come from. Clearly, for those bigger, more contentious disposals in particular, and some of the bigger leases or some of the more contentious leases, they'll come back here anyway. So I think that gives you a level of comfort, because officers aren't going to want to be the ones that are responsible for making decisions about those ones which have big community focus. So I think there is some comfort for you there. I think we might be able to spell this out a little bit more detail when we bring the policy itself back in September. I think we're getting a little bit hung up on some of the detail, but I would urge you just to remember that there is a scheme of delegation which is not new.
Right, Councillor Ward, last time.
Thanks for your indulgence, Chairman. It's quite interesting because I can remember as portfolio holder, I used to get lots of things that would be officer delegation, and I would get to see them, basically to sign off and look. Now, I'm just wondering if, we've changed the system. I don't think it's necessarily good that some of these things go through without proper notice. And I've got to really support Councillor Mason in what he has just said, that realistically, irrespective, at least for members or a senior member to have a look at decisions that are being taken on our behalf, need to be on our behalf. And I say this because I know that, and I think we all know, that decisions being made by officers, if they're not looked at and not scrutinised and actually questioned and challenged sometimes they're perfectly good. Yeah, everything's fine. But it's just the opportunity to challenge. And I think that's a vital, vital instrument that the council and members need, because we, as the face of the public, we take the brickbats if something goes through and we've not seen it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. So, obviously we are a member-led council, so I hear what you're saying. So I'm going to come back to Councillor Mason, and then it's Councillor Wootton. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. There's an interesting parallel here that it doesn't matter whether you were involved in a committee system or a cabinet system. The parallel is clearly the delegated responsibilities that officers have under planning. Under planning, we know there's a hell of a lot delegated, and quite right, and otherwise we would get totally bogged down in committee, particularly those who are in development committee. And we do have the list circulated to members that does actually set out what delegated decisions have been taken. And we do have a purview of those after the event. And in planning, it's hard to call them back. But in this case, we have a situation where if we did have a schedule circulated to this committee, which summarised the terms and conditions broadly that have been applied to a lease, then if there were concerns raised by any member, just the same as we do in planning, or more particularly ward members, or because community representatives have raised it, then why shouldn't we have it on the agenda, and why shouldn't it go through quite quickly if everything is square? I rest my case, my lord.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Councillor Wootton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Look, at the risk...
Sorry.
At the risk of hammering the nail, I think this actually distills down to an operational process. The point has been made quite clearly here. Councillor Mason has stolen exactly the parallel that I was going to make about delegated powers under planning. It works pretty well. We see that. I don't particularly like the word challenge, with the greatest of respect to my colleague on the left, because that implies that we're going to necessarily disagree. I think it's about communication and information, particularly for issues that affect ward members, because residents talk to us about that. But I think it's about an operational process. It's nothing, well, I say nothing more than that. I think there's a bit of work to be done, but I think it is as simple as that, to make sure that we're kept aware and informed of what's going on. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, Fiona, final time.
I'm not going to get into further conversation in detail, because I think it is something that we can bring back and talk further about when we bring the actual policies. The only thing just final point for me really is just around timescales and how often committees are around the sort of day-to-day running of what officers have to do. So look, I think we can take it away and have a look at it. But obviously it may not line up with officers can't wait 3 months for decisions all the time. So it might be a bit retrospective if a list would come back, but I think we need to take it away and look at it.
Oh, okay, members, right? Okay, so Fiona's going to take it away and come back to us with that. So, is there any other questions, members? No. Right. So, members, from the chair, I'll move recommendation 1 to agree on the principles of a disposal policy and a lease policy, which will form the basis of a more detailed policy documents, which will be brought back to members in September 2024. Members, do I have a seconder? I'll second. Yep. Councillor Mason. Members, all those in favour? Great, that's unanimous. Thanks, members. Sorry. Members, item 7, asset management strategy and framework. Members, we will now consider the report of the Director of Assets and Investments seeking approval to the principles outlined in this report in order to bring a more detailed strategy and framework back to the committee. The report begins on page 7.1. Mr. Beer, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. So, so this report seeks to review and refresh the 10-year policy strategy that was agreed in 2018. Obviously, things have moved on since then, and we feel it's appropriate to review that strategy and to bring that back to members. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Councillor Mason, sorry.
Just take it as a standing order, Chairman. I'll be here, raring to go, every meeting, loads of questions.
As expected,
Thank you
Councillor
so
Mason.
much. It's an important but relatively small point, but it's one that's going to be important to residents. Under paragraph 3.2, I think there's a list there of things that we would need to do under an appropriate strategy. It talks about partnerships, but it doesn't talk about public consultations. And I would like to see public consultations in there, particularly in the last municipal year. I was questioned several times about public consultations and visions, and I made it clear that public consultations were part of the game. So I'd like to see that amplified within the scope of that listing, and maybe just promote public consultation amongst partnerships more certainly. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Is there any other questions? Councillor Belton?
I will also be here asking lots of questions just behind Councillor Mason every meeting.
That's brilliant. That's what we want.
Just a couple of minor points, really. Under 3.2.5, work towards a carbon neutral estate. I was quite surprised that the target's been removed, given the importance that last year's administration or certain members of last year's administration placed on calling a climate emergency. And that seems to me, by removing the target, we're just taking all pressure off. So that surprised and disappointed me. We know 2030 is almost impossible to achieve based on the stock that we have, but a target is exactly that. It's something to strive to work towards. And by removing it altogether, we're ultimately giving ourselves a free pass. So that disappointed me. Item 7, look at opportunities at how the council can increase the supply of homes. That made me happy. I was glad to see that we're looking at that. But just a bit more detail. Are we considering owning stock, or are we going to look at the empty homes problem that I've highlighted a number of times? Is there any more detail? I know this is a summary. I know this is about providing something that comes next, but considering we're not going to see anything till January 2025, I'd like a little bit more meat on the bones now, so that when it comes back in 6 months, we're not sort of having to pick it apart because there's lots missing.
Mr. Beer?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't that level of detail at the moment. I think the intention is certainly to work with housing colleagues to work much closer. So we would have the corporate estate, we've got the commercial estate, and obviously we've got the housing estate. So I think the idea is to bring those three strands together. So it's more of a, again, holistic approach. So certainly that will be part of the strategy.
Okay, thank you. And regarding the target being removed, is that a member decision or is that a?
No, and and sorry, just to jump in here, I would have thought that this would have been in line with our current policy anyway. So that's probably why it's not just written there. But obviously that's the current policy. So I would expect this to, align with that. Did you have anything to add, Mr. Beer? No. No. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, well, hopefully in January 2025, 2030 will be reinstated within the body of it. But I take your point that this should be working towards the current policy that we have.
The policy's not changed. That's been agreed. So that's what I would hope we're all
I'm comfortable with that, and that we'll see the detail in the actual report. I just wanted to highlight it because it did surprise me somewhat.
Councillor Ward.
Thank you very much, Chairman. This is actually looking at item 7 on 3.2. The opportunities for increased homes. Now, it's an interesting thing in the differences with the one team, between Brentwood and ourselves, where Brentwood actually manage their own housing and have their own social management, but we outsource. Now, I would like to know, would we be actually thinking of increasing social housing within the district and actually managing it ourselves the same? Because we've moved to a committee system, we're harmonising between the councils. Would that be something that this council, this administration, would be looking to do to get more people on the housing ladder, to provide housing? We know we have a big problem and we do need to supply social housing within this district. I'm just wondering what the view is coming across in regards to that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. Fiona.
So I can't really answer that, if I'm honest, only because item 7 on here is around looking at opportunities. So it's quite a big question you've asked, and I'm not sure that's something as somebody bringing this report we can really answer at this point. What I can say to you is the asset management strategy will allow for all opportunities to be looked at, and of course that is one of them. So I think at the moment we're focusing on what the headlines are that we've taken away and worked up into the strategy. It's a little bit early to say exactly what those opportunities are that will be looked at. Sorry, that's probably not a great answer.
Okay, Councillor Belton and then Councillor Wootton. Thank you.
Sorry, just a more of a general question is, whilst this new strategy and framework is being developed, will that delay any other decisions being taken in the interim? So things will go ahead business as usual under the current strategies and policies?
That's my understanding, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Belton. Councillor Wootton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. On 3.2, I think it's always a little bit dangerous to say there are 7 overarching principles. These are. I probably would have worded it in my days of writing reports. There are a number of overarching principles which include, because it invites the question, how confident are we that these are 7 overarching principles? I start to sort of think, how did you arrive at those who came up with the magic 7? Are there others that if we had a huddle, we could come up with others prioritisation? I'm just wondering.
Thank you, Councillor Wootton. And perhaps 7 is Mr. Beer's lucky number, or maybe not. Mr. Beer.
Yeah, no, it has no personal significance. I think what we tried to do with 7 was to cover as many of the broader areas that we could. But I accept that 7 is not a definitive number. Is if there are suggestions for an 8th or a 9th, then obviously we'd be happily include those too.
Well, Chairman, at the risk
Thank
of
you.
being flippant, we might pull it down to 6 or 5, but there we are.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Beard.
I don't want to prolong this discussion about that particular point. What you have here is a sort of standard set of principles that you would find in many asset management strategies. So I didn't put the principles there, but I suspect that's where this has come from. If you look at most asset management strategies, they need to have certain things in them, and these are the things that you would expect to see. There may be one or two others that will come out as we go through the writing of the strategy, but they're pretty standard. The new addition over the years, of course, has been the carbon neutral, and I would absolutely expect that to be in there. So hopefully that helps to make you feel comfortable that this is fairly normal practice.
And back to Councillor Mason, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I would just say that I'm not that keen on cut and paste. I'm not that keen on it at all. I'm more keen to actually have the council, work out what its 7 overarching particulars and interests are, rather than just take them off a template and put them into yet another report. Things only get challenged when people like Councillor Wootton or I or Councillor Belton or others around the table actually challenge it. We have. So there's more than 7. We've already said that. So 7 is not something I'd want to patch to, and I think we should be developing those 7 overarching bases the next time we see it.
Point taken, Councillor Mason. Thank you. Councillor Wilson, please. Oh, Mr. Wilson. Oh, blinking. Councillor Mr. Stuart Wilson, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Could I ask about paragraph 6.1, which is the risks? And the risk says the risk is unable to agree proposals for assets. But we're talking about developing a strategy here. And so the risk should be not developing a strategy. I know this sounds like a nitpicking point, but it looks to me that we're talking about the risks later on once we've developed the strategy. Is that what it's saying?
Do you want me to take that?
Thanks.
Well, it's a bit subjective, I suppose, in terms of that. But I think what it's trying to say is that if we don't have an up-to-date asset management strategy, it will slow down or hinder proposals coming forward in the future. So the strategy provides a framework for future decisions to be made. So I think that's what it's trying to say. It might be a bit clumsy, but I think that is what it's trying to say.
Yep, come back, Mr. Stuart
Would it be
Wilson.
possible to reword that to make it a little bit more tight and focused to exactly what you've said?
When we come back with the main policy, there will be a risk register in the report, so we'll make sure we refine it in that.
Thank you. Members, are there any other questions? No? I won't ask if everyone's all right. Okay, members. So from the chair, I will move R1 to agree the principles to refresh and develop an asset management strategy and framework for 2025-2030. Do I have a seconder, members? Councillor Wilson, Mr. Stuart Wilson. Okay, members, on a show of hands, please. All those in favour? And that's unanimous. Thank you very much, members. Right. Okay, members, so you'll be pleased to know that that concludes our business for this evening. Thank you for your attendance, and it all ends at 20:33. Thank you.